on Sunday, the 17th of September 1944, at around 9:30, the gliders and aircraft took off from Down Ampney, RAF Down Ampney. Number 286, Chalk 286, contained the surgical unit number 1 team, which was Stanley Biggs' unit. 287 was the second surgical team. The tow rope for Stanley's glider actually snapped before takeoff, so they were actually delayed, and they actually took off after the Unit 2's glider. Amazingly, on landing at this landing zone, so this is landing zone S, we even have our own Dakota. On landing zone S, over 130 gliders landed, and a number of those for 181. There was other units, there was the 1st Boarders, the South Staffs, KOSB, which were over there, so the landing zone actually extends beyond every side, north, south, east and west here. And the second surgical unit that took off before Stanley's actually had a bit of a mishap on landing. Their glider actually, upturned, but it went on its side. So the Jeep and the trailer that was inside, even though they were all strapped in, they were actually suspended. So it took them hours to get the Jeep and the trailer back out and ready to go. So because of that delay, and even despite the mishap with the tow rope, surgical team number 1 were actually the first to be ready. They'd gone down to the rendezvous, which we're going to head down to, and then they'd selected a house, number 9, which again we'll be heading towards on Deutsches Kampfweg. So to give you a bit of perspective, I'm just going to show you whereabouts we are, where landing zone S was located. So the best point of reference to finding landing zone S, I find, is finding Rijers Camp, which is here, and that is actually in that direction, so forwards. And then as you look out and up, this here is landing zone S, and all along this side, and some people might recognise the Ginkle Heath, as we call it. So landing zone S essentially ran alongside Rijers Camp, so it's more or less centre to that. Now I believe anyway, reading Bruce Jeffrey's account, Lieutenant Bruce Jeffrey, he was also in 181. He actually mentions a wooded road, or wooded path, crossroad, and I believe that's there, which makes absolute sense, because later on the unit moved down, 181 moved down to number 9 on Deutsches Kampfweg, and this is here. So yeah, so this is to give you a bit of perspective. Now, even greater perspective, this is where they started. And the bridge is here. The unit got as far as this area here in Oosterbeek. So laden up, the men from 181 made their way down to the RV. Can you imagine? It was over 130 gliders. There was men, there was jeeps, there was trailers, there was aircraft going over, there was parachutes, there was supplies, there was flying fleas, there was push bikes. It would have been absolute pandemonium. And of course, that was just the first lift. So we actually then had 3 more days, 3 in total, 2 more days of lifts all across Arnhem. So this is just one landing zone. So you had several other landing zones, you had other drop zones as well. So yeah, it's would have just been utter chaos. And I think as well, it's important, just to put it into perspective, into context. This would have been a Sunday afternoon, so they landed around about 1:30 on a Sunday, and the residents of this beautiful, peaceful town, even though they were occupied, they would not have been expecting this enormous airborne armada to descend on them on a Sunday afternoon in September 1944. So, and this is what I believe was the RV point for 181, and they would have then quickly made their way down Duitskamweg. So it would have been around about 4:30 that the surgical team were ready to go, ready to operate at number 9. This was actually an MDS, a medical dressing station, the main dressing station, and it was purely temporary for the initial period of the operation, which was, of course, a successful landing of other troops. And all while this is happening, of course, all the other units, all the other regiments are making their way or trying to make their way to the bridge at Arnhem. So, and it was actually very, very soon, I believe it would have been almost an immediate occurrence where the surgical unit, medical unit, would have actually then received patients and wounded. So particularly from the nearby Sea Troop Reconnaissance Corps. And here is number 9. So this is where Stanley Biggs and his surgical team and the 2nd surgical team were based. So from Sunday afternoon, so after they landed, all the way to Sunday afternoon, all the way through to Monday, we believe sort of Monday evening, they had then successfully moved all the casualties, all of their equipment down to the main dressing station on the crossroads in a hotel called the Schönord. Interestingly, this is actually where there's the only footage and therefore photograph of Stanley Biggs. This is actually the house that was taken. And interestingly, in that photo, there's a mix of surgical units 1 and 2. So you actually see a number of the chaps from both units. And because of that, we believe it was actually at the point where they had finished and they were about to move out from this location to the next. So to give you a bit of a perspective and context about the direction of the battle, by Sunday evening, 60 casualties had been admitted to the temporary medical station. By Monday morning, 200 casualties had been admitted. So yeah, just to give you an idea of the turn of events in less than 24 hours. The reality for that is, as well, is that all of those casualties had to be moved to the next medical dressing station, so the next MDS. So, and that would, of course, taken several lifts, because all they had were jeeps. So they would have only been able to carry 2 stretchers at a time. So we're on Utrechtsweg. This is the main road into Oosterbeek that the troops took. There's a lot of footage, countless regiments paused. And coming up behind me is actually one of the main greens. This was actually a supply drop. 250 Company HQ is over here, and then to our right is the Harchenstein, it's the divisional headquarters. So as we carry on down into the town, we start to see more and more references to the airborne, more flags, more Pegasus. And this is to the now infamous crossroads. So Oosterbeek, before the battle, was as it is now, it's a holiday destination. There was a number of hotels, and on the left-hand side there was a hotel here, and a hotel opposite as well. The hotel Schoonord was chosen by 181 as the main dressing station. So we're now at the infamous crossroads. So as you can see here, it is an incredibly busy street, and it was incredibly important, became more and more important as the battle progressed. Early on the 18th, 181 decided to set up a medical dressing station up at the Schoonord Hotel, which is right behind me. It doesn't look like what it used to look like anymore. It's actually more akin to the Freywick Hotel, which was also used mostly as a ward for 181. It's actually one corporal was located there after 133 struggled to get set up in there. So the Schoonord is and remained the main dressing station for 181 and a number of other medical units that were essentially taking in walking wounded. All of the Monday predominantly was set up with, the whole unit was occupied with moving the existing casualties that they already had, so near the 200 or so, from Wolfhazer all the way down into the Schoonord. At the same time as establishing that hotel as an ideal working base, they also looked down Petersburg Weg at another hotel called the Tafelberg, and this was selected to be the surgery. So this is where the surgical team set up. That's where Stanley Biggs would have operated from predominantly. However, they were always going back and forth, and there was actually a number of other buildings down that street that were then adopted and used by various elements of 181. So we've just passed the Schoonord, and then further along down here are a number of other larger houses. A garage, which is just coming up on the left. And then also there was a school, and that was actually used by Paddy Doyle. He was involved with number 5 section. He was a medical officer. So as we head down Petersburg Weg, bearing in mind this is the idea is that surgery would be continued and carried out down here from the medical dressing station where they would be assessed. They would either be remain there or come down for surgery and then go back up for and placed into the ward, due to the fact that there was actually very limited space left in the Tafelberg. So this is what would have been Tafelberg Hotel, and this was chosen mostly by Christopher James and Rigby Jones as the best location. It's within the perimeter. It was actually, at the time, it was away from the fighting as well, and it was selected for the surgical teams. there was actually already existing civilian patients inside with an existing Red Cross doctors, nurses also inside. They actually took part and became part of the medical team that were working out of the Tafelberg. The actual building itself was more or less destroyed at the time, and then afterwards, and it was actually only rebuilt, as we see now, in 2006. And they restored it, the front, to essentially what it was built as originally. There were other buildings as well that formed the Tafelberg. So we know that there was a garage here and an annex building, and then several other outbuildings. And as you can see now, that's been completely redeveloped. Because space was a huge issue at the time, the annex was actually used by the Surgical Unit 1, so Stanley Biggs unit, at some point, and operations were carried out there. But predominantly, operations were carried out in the Tafelberg. There was a room at the back that was used as a preference, and then the room at the front with these two very, very large windows were used to house those that were waiting on operations or had been operated on. And it got incredibly full, incredibly quickly. So James's account is one of the most informed and most detailed about what was actually happening in the Tafelberg, and on a day-to-day basis he was able to keep a very good record of the operations that he took part in, as well as also the actual happenings of any casualties amongst the medical teams. And it is actually with James's account, along with one other, that we're able to narrow down, and I believe to corroborate with each other, the day and the occurrence of Stanley's death. But before that, we're going to go and have a look inside. So as you can see, the archway, this is all as was, and the large windows here were actually, by the particularly James again mentions it, says I think they were trying to be incredibly polite and not damage and cause any damage to property. They deliberately didn't break the windows, even though they realised that there was obviously going to be quite a bit of danger involved if they were to smash over patients. When they did finally crack, they then decided to break the glass out. But it actually took until about the 24th for them to realise that was probably the best course of action. So anyway, let's head inside. So once they realised that the perimeter was closing in on them, there was mortars positions set up incredibly close. They were a target, unfortunately, and there was a number of explosions hitting the Tafelberg, and one resulted in the roof where the surgery was being taken place to cave in. And it wasn't necessarily the fact that they couldn't clear the debris away, it's the fact that they couldn't actually clean the medical surgical equipment to continually and safely administer operations on the actual patients. So surgical unit 2 ceased operating for quite some time. My understanding is that unit 1 continued until a little later, and then again the water ran out and they just weren't able to sterilise anything. By the Sunday, the Germans had taken over and they lined the medical team, the British Army medical team, outside, and that's when we get another account, Tom Bannister's account, where they lined the men outside of the garage again, which was here, and the garage was being used as a morgue by this time, and because they weren't able to bury the dead. And Stanley, at the time, obviously with his sense of humour, whispered to Tom Bannister while the Germans had lined them up, and he said, well, at least they won't have to take us far. On Monday, the 25th of September, at some point during the day, another hit went through the Tafelberg, and it actually damaged and smashed the stairs, the famous stairs. It hit Christopher James, and he was then able to learn afterwards that one of the civilian Red Cross nurses had been killed, as well as Stanley Biggs. So at what point in the day, I'm not really sure, but we know that it's narrowed down to daytime. At some stage, after the retreat, after the cessation of the battle, the mass grave in front of the tree, in front of the Tafelberg, was dug, and a number of British soldiers, so 36, were buried just here, including Stanley Biggs. This painting that used to hang in the Schoonord restaurant was painted by Reg Curtis. He was injured on the first day, and he was a member of the 1st Parachute Battalion. He was transported to the Tafelberg Hotel following his initial treatment at Duitzer-Kampberg. It's really interesting to see this painting because the detail that he goes into is really indicative of what it was actually like during the battle. From May 1945, the work began to find a final resting place for the war dead of Oosterbeek, Arnhem and the surrounding area. There were mass graves dotted all over the town and the surrounding area, including the one outside the Tafelberg, which was home to the final resting place for Stanley and around 35 others. By June, this field to the north of Oosterbeek had been selected thanks to the work of the Ter Horst family. Jan Ter Horst, who was the mayor of Oosterbeek, had returned home to find that his own garden had been converted into a mass grave. The work for reinterring the dead began in June 1945, and initially every grave had a wooden cross marker, and it was thanks to the tireless work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission began. By 1952, every grave had a stone marker. The cross of sacrifice had been placed, the stone of remembrance, and the landscape, which is so synonymous with a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery, had been completed and is very much as you see today. Stanley is buried towards the top corner of the cemetery. There's over 1,760 graves in this cemetery alone. And just to give you an indication of the work involved by the Commonwealth War Graves, at the time it took around a week to carve one headstone. One of the most evocative aspects of the commemorations here in Arnhem Oosterbeek Cemetery is the fact that since 1946, school children from the local area adopt a grave. They look after that grave, they lay flowers at that grave, and it is something that I understand that they take with them into adulthood and they pass on to future generations as well. During this trip, I've been contacted by a relation of another 181 medical orderly, and he's very kindly sent across a letter that another veteran back in 1959 sent to his grandfather. And in this letter, the author, Arthur Webb, writes to Geoffrey Owens about returning to Arnhem after so many years with a number of other 181 veterans for a reunion. He then relays the story that when he was captured and taken prisoner, in the chaos of battle, he'd lost his own small pack, his own personal items, and he picked up one that was going spare. This happened to be Stanley Biggs' small pack. He took it with him to Appledorn, where he was in recuperation and then became a prisoner of war. And inside that small pack was Stanley Biggs' berry, which Arthur Webb wore for the rest of his career in the airborne and kept with him until 1959, when he returned it to Stanley and his grave.